Wow, I'm so impressed that all of you took time out of your evening to be here. Thank you for coming. My name is Mallory Van Abema. I work on the community services team here in the city of Shoreline, and I have the great honor of facilitating this session, CityLearn, which happens monthly, typically on our fourth Thursdays of the month here in council chambers. We also have an audience online, so if you ever want to tune in to CityLearn, you can always do so virtually. You just have to register in advance. It's all available on the website. Tonight, we are talking about updates, draft updates to our private tree code. And after long and intentional work with the community advisory group, we'll be unveiling some draft tree codes on July 16th. July 16th, they'll go in front of the Planning Commission, but this evening we've had, from the 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock hour, really just the simple, broken down updates to very complex rules that used to exist in our code book about private tree codes and managing them. So again, we are talking about trees on private property. We're not talking about trees in the right of way, and we're here this evening with our planning staff from Planning and Community Development, who are going to talk to you in a bit, who are leading this work and have had that chance to work alongside the advisory group to develop these draft updates. We have a lot of content to cover this evening, so we know that you all probably have questions and comments that you'd like to air, and we will welcome those. Because we have an online audience, we'll ask that you wait until you have a microphone in your hand to speak. Otherwise, no one online is going to be able to hear you. So we've got to capture everything into our mics. And our online audience, if you are familiar with the chat function at the bottom of your screen, that's where you can leave your comments and your questions if you have them as they come up. But without further ado, we have a lot to cover this evening, so I'm going to pass it over to our council member who's going to welcome us to the space and give us a bit of some remarks related to this update that's underway now, and I'm going to welcome Keith Scully, member of the Shoreline City Council, up to offer some remarks.
Awesome, thank you. You don't need to applaud yet, I haven't said anything. So my name's Keith Scully. I've been on the Shoreline City Council for 10 years. I was on the Planning Commission for 5 years before that. And I would tell you this is one of the most complex and challenging policy issues that we ever confront. I want to recognize Valerie Snyder, who's a fellow council member. I don't see anybody else here, but I do. Yes, thank you. I do want to start with what I think is a funny story about former Councilmember Janet Way, who's sitting right there, and she knows what it's going to be, and it may embarrass her a bit. But back in the day, there was an issue over particular trees that were being cut, and the city manager got a call saying, Janet Way just tied herself to a tree. So the issues and the challenges go back a long time. And I want to start maybe not even at 50,000 feet, but at 100,000 feet to talk about some of the competing policy concerns that go into a tree code. So tree code affects our living environment, it also affects the regional environment, and it affects housing and the cost of housing. I want to start with sort of the regional environmental thing. If we were to take a hypothetical 100 families that need housing in this area and decide where to put them, if we put them in an existing forested land, say outside of Issaquah, we lose thousands, probably tens of thousands of trees. And we have to build all new infrastructure out there, which causes environmental concerns, costs a lot of money, those houses up being expensive. If we put all 100 of them in a single apartment building here in Shoreline, obviously, even if there were trees on that particular site, the loss of trees is much less. And that's why we promote urban density, partly for affordability, partly because some folks want to live in apartments, and partly for regional and global environmental reasons. So should we all pack ourselves into concrete boxes along Aurora? Of course not. Nobody wants that, and it turns out that trees have some pretty significant local environmental benefits right here in Shoreline. An individual tree out in the forest filters a lot of stormwater, that's great. Here in Shoreline, where we have a ton of impervious surface, filtering that stormwater becomes incredibly important. It takes toxins out of the stormwater, which would otherwise flow straight to the Puget Sound. It reduces the flow going to the Puget Sound. Creates wildlife habitat. There is not a single part of this city, because we have water on both sides, where it's impossible to see a bald eagle. And I lived in Ridgecrest for a long time, and now I'm in Richmond Beach. We see them regularly in both places. And one of the reasons they come here is we've got mature Douglas firs for them to roost in. Without those, we lose the wildlife habitat. There are also tremendous just mental health and personal well-being benefits to living in a treed city, to having trees along the streets so there's shade on the sidewalk, to having mature, full native trees so we realize that we do live in a forested area, and just living in a space that doesn't feel like a concrete jungle. So those are the super broad brush things to balance. I'm going to throw an additional one in there too, which is private property. It's the fact that this is a city regulation about private property. This tree code does not affect what we do in parks, it doesn't affect what we do in the right-of-way. This affects what you folks do on your own properties. And the basic justification for that is we wouldn't let anybody start a pig farm here in Shoreline because that would really harm your neighbors, right? I mean, nobody wants to live next to a pig farm. Cutting down all the trees in your lot is much less of an impact than starting up a tree farm, but it still affects everybody around you. It affects the air quality, it affects the water quality, all the things I just talked about. So that's where government's, we call it, lawyers speak, police power to regulate trees comes from. And I don't want to distract from staff diving deep on content, but I do want to give you just a little history on why we're updating this now, and I want to talk about one specific thing that's in place now that we are going to fix. So the tree code has had a complicated, convoluted path in my 15 years here on the, city government and before, and we've updated it kind of in sections. And when we've done different things like cottage housing and some of the new land use regulations we have, we've revisited parts of it. But we've never really taken a comprehensive look at today, whether it's working. And I will tell you, in my view as a council member, it is achieving some things, but it's not getting us to where we need to be. On the one hand, we are still seeing a significant loss in tree coverage here in Shoreline. On the other hand, we've got folks who are, I think, rightly upset that as a homeowner, they have to spend a ton of money or they're just not allowed to remove a tree that they believe is hazardous or they simply want gone. So striking that balance is where we're at, and I'll talk about sort of the process of that in a minute, but I do want to note one thing. We passed a short-term fee increase that was designed to stop folks from sort of rushing to the chainsaw while we had this tree code update in place. That means that if you want to cut down a tree, if it's hazardous, you can just do it, but if it's not hazardous, the fee is tremendous. That's not permanent. And I want to note this thing here, hazard and nuisance trees. One of the things we want to fix is making sure we aren't harming homeowners who have a tree that they believe threatens their house. They shouldn't have to prove that it actually does if they want to get rid of that tree. And if they want to get rid of that tree, they should be able to pay a fair permit rate. So this is an iterative process. We commissioned outside consultants as well as our own city staff to take a look at this. They've had a focus group. They've involved homeowners, different neighborhood representatives, building industry folks, tree preservation folks, and they've come up with a rough draft. And I want to emphasize that it is a rough draft. Now is the time to get your comments in if you think part of it doesn't go far enough, goes too far, or is wrong in some way. There's some stages to come. The Planning Commission is the city's volunteer board that looks at any development regulation. They take comments. They then make changes to it, recommended changes, and ultimately they come to City Council where there's even more comment periods. And I will tell you, from 10 years here, nothing is set in stone until we've enacted it. So now is the time to speak up if you think there's a problem with it. And rest assured, we will listen. It's 7:10. I have twins, and my wife is taking one of them to Vancouver to watch a soccer game. So the other one is at home being delighted to be alone. I've told him I will leave here at 8. So I'm going to be around for any questions until then, but unfortunately I'm not going to be able to stay the whole time. Thank you all for being here, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mallory to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Councilmember Scully. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you very much. I don't have a belabored introduction now. We're going to transition right into our presenters here from the Planning and Community Development Department. I'll ask them to come up, use these here handheld microphones, introduce yourselves. Your clicker is here for slides. But first, this is Sierra, who's going to kick us off.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sierra Carson. I am a senior long-range planner here with the City of Shoreline, and I have been the project manager on the city side for the tree code update process. I'm joined here tonight by Kim Frappier from Facet. She has been leading the consultant team supporting us with this tree code update. They have extensive experience working with cities in the Puget Sound area on tree codes and have extensive experience just with evaluating trees in general. I also have two additional staff from our department here, Kevin Bagwell and Alex Clark, who will be here to assist answering questions if they come up. And I am very excited to spend the next hour or so informing you about what we've been doing for the last 6 months. So I'm going to go over a quick introduction about the project, just what our goals are, our timeline, and some of the key things we've heard from the engagement we've done so far. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through 4 key changes to policy that are happening with the tree code update. At this time, I'm really happy to answer questions that folks have. So we can, at points in the process, stop to answer questions. But if you want to share your comments or concerns, I would really encourage you to provide that for us today using the sticky notes we have. We have an online comment form. Come to Planning Commission, come to City Council, voice your comments that way. So, as was stated earlier, we have been working with a community advisory group to support us with the development of this tree code. So we're kind of at this halfway to 3/4 point of our process. Everything being presented here is very draft. We are at the point where we have policy written, we have code written, we have a plan of what we think the code could be, and we're communicating it, but there's still opportunity to provide comment and guide the development of the code as we continue to move forward. We're going to be taking this, as stated, to Planning Commission on July 16th, working with them through the summer, and then moving to the City Council process in the fall and winter of 26, looking at adopting these regulations at the end of 26 or early 27. Our goals for this update are to support our citywide goals. And those citywide goals include having and maintaining and increasing our tree canopy cover for all of the amazing benefits that they provide, as our Councilmember Scully stated. But we also want to make sure that that's balanced with our housing goals, that we have goals to provide for more dense housing around our light rail stations. We have goals to provide for more affordable housing. We have goals to allow for use of property. And so how do we make sure that we are regulating trees in a way that is balancing all these different competing interests? And also make it make sense, because we need to talk to the community about these rules, and we want to make sure that we understand them and you understand sort of what pathways are for either retaining or removing or planting trees. And we also want to make sure that the trees that we don't want to see in the urban environment have a clear pathway to be removed. This is just kind of repeating our last piece, but when we talk about trees and housing, these don't need to be competing interests. They do have different goals, but we want to create a code that acknowledges that both of these pieces are important to our community and they should work together and in tandem. And just a little bit of expectation setting, the things we can and cannot do when writing a tree code. When I talk tonight about property owners, a property owner, we can't really differentiate between whether someone is a property owner, a homeowner doing a little project in their backyard, or whether someone is a developer. Any homeowner who wants to build anything is developing their property. And so all development is all sort of under the same bucket of, if you want to improve your property, that is development, and that is what we are regulating. We also know that we've heard from our community that retaining large and big trees is very important. So that's been instilled into all of the recommendations in the code. But we want to set the expectation that we can't keep all big trees, that we want to prioritize where it makes sense to keep them and have strong protections for keeping some of them, but not all of them. And having better requirements for seeing development built around and accommodating trees, but knowing that there's still a lot of pieces that happen during the development process. We have fire access requirements. We have, where is the garbage truck going to go? There's a lot of sort of moving pieces when it comes to sites and building development that need to be accommodated. But things we can do, we want to make sure that we are prioritizing saving some large trees. that we are making sure the development, when it can build around trees, that we are prioritizing the trees we want to keep, so it's not just, we're not keeping just the little ones, we're keeping the big ones too, and that we are scaling our code so that it's good, it works in the zone, for the development that's allowed in the zone that it is. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And that we require planting trees in the right place, that we're not sort of creating new hazards in the future, that we're not requiring people to build and plant trees too close to their homes, because those could, in future, become a hazard or a nuisance. And we have, as was stated earlier, we've done a lot of extensive public outreach on this process. We had a community survey in January. We got 1,000 responses. And so throughout this presentation, I'm going to be talking about what we heard from the community and how that's been incorporated into the draft code so far. And so we want to make sure, again, that we are preserving large trees. That's been heard very strongly, that we're allowing for flexibility, that we are not making this a burdensome process, and we have very clear objective standards, and you know how the road that you need to follow in order to remove or not remove a tree. So I'm going to get into these core policy pieces. What are we even regulating? So when we talk about regulating a tree, we're talking about, in the tree code, it is trees on private property, so not trees in the right-of-way and not trees on publicly owned property. And that is like parks and city facilities. We're also not talking about trees in critical areas. Those are covered under a critical areas code. And so anything that's going to be close to a steep slope or near a stream or near a wetland, all of that vegetation is regulated differently, and it's not something we're talking about tonight. And that's all protected vegetation anyways. And we regulate trees that are 6 inches or greater in diameter. We have some little wood cookies in the back so you can get an idea of sort of how big that really is. So currently, we regulate trees 6 inches or greater in diameter. All trees, once they hit 6 inch, are valued exactly the same. So if you have to save 2 trees out of 4, you could save 2 small trees, and they are worth the same amount as saving 2 big trees, because all trees that are over 6 inches are all worth the same. But once you get to 24 inches, we have a fee to protect those trees. And so we find this to be an issue, because it's not clear what is being prioritized, because all trees are worth the same. And we have these fees for large trees, and that becomes an issue for removing very large trees if it makes sense to remove them. So in the new code, we are still going to continue to regulate trees at 6 inches in diameter at breast height. But we're going to start assigning a value for trees depending on their size. And so a small tree is going to be worth less, and a large tree is going to be worth more. And this is going to let us sort of calibrate and value larger trees more than smaller trees. Because now I need 6 small trees to be equal the same amount as 1 big tree. And so now our big trees are worth more. We're going to get more into credits later. So during that survey I talked about, we asked the community if they thought that we should have extra protections, restrictions, or replacement requirements for large mature trees. Because again, we currently have that fee for large trees, and we had heard from conversations with the community that large trees were important. And we had, let's see, this is a large percentage of people, it's 36 plus 20, it's over 50%, almost 60% of community respondents said yes, there should be more protections for very large trees. And we also talked to our community advisory group about this. Our community advisory group was very supportive of having extra protections for very large trees. And they also really cared about groves of trees, because not all trees are big. And there might be smaller trees that have the potential to get big in the future. And so what about sort of large stands of trees and large groves of trees? So what we have done is we have created a definition for an exceptional tree. And an exceptional tree is going to be any tree that is over 24 inches in diameter at breast height. I don't have a Wookiee or a wood cookie that's that big tonight. And it's also going to include large groves that if I had 3 or more trees, that all sort of had a credit value that added up to 12, we'll talk about that 12 number later, that would also be considered exceptional. So we are going to put protections on things that are exceptional. This does not mean that they can't be removed for some reason. It just means that they have extra protections on removal on them. And we may want to go through more steps to decide what makes sense as far as removal. And we've also decided that there are some trees that just grow really fast and aren't great in the urban environment. Those are our cottonwood alder trees. They're wonderful native trees, but they might not be the best trees to protect in the environment. They do grow very fast, but they may not work great with dense urban development. So that is what an exceptional tree is. Any questions? Excellent. All right. I got one question. All right. The question was, do we have any idea how many exceptional trees there are in the city? The answer is no, I do not. We do know that there are quite a few exceptional trees, but we find them coming up quite a bit. But that is something that we have not been able to evaluate. We're going to take 3 questions. We'll do Janet and then.
Hello. So I have a problem with the word some when you said that what we can do is save some trees, which, you know, some trees is better than none, but it seems like we should be a little more proactive than that, like most trees or many trees or something a little more proactive than some. Some is like 2, you know, and we're going to save 2 trees in the whole city. That's some. But we want to do more than that. So I think we need better wording.
I appreciate that comment, and once I get through nuisance, we're going to talk about exactly how we decide exceptional tree, how many it makes sense to retain or not. And I think we had a 3rd question here.
Just really quick, will an exceptional tree be in a critical zone?
In a critical zone?
Uh-huh.
And
so
like
a slope or?
So no. If, like I said, when you're in a critical area, we regulate those trees differently under the critical area code. So there's
no exceptional connotation in that portion of the code?
No.
Okay. All right.
All right. If you have additional questions, we have posted notes in the back, and we will continue to try to answer questions throughout the presentation and then after the presentation as well. All right, so nuisance and hazard trees. A nuisance and a hazard tree is the part in our new code where we are going to define what will always be allowed to be removed regardless of the size of that tree. So if something is a hazard or nuisance, it's something that has the potential to cause harm or is currently causing harm, those are not trees either to your house or to utilities, or it might fall. That is what a hazard or the nuisance section covers. And so this is sort of the process you would follow and the regulations you follow if you wanted to remove a tree which is a danger or causing infrastructure issues. So our current code, it says that trees that are clearly dead or dying, those are exempt. It says trees that pose an immediate hazard, those are exempt. If you have a tree that may be a hazard in like a year or so, or a tree that is very healthy, it's very robust, but it's growing into your water line, those are not currently exempt. Those are currently trees that we need you to retain or potentially pay a fee to remove. And so we find that to be an issue in our current code that we want to make sure is resolved in the new code. So exemptions. Exemptions that I just stated, those are continue to stay the same. If you have a tree that is dead or dying, or a tree that is an immediate danger to yourself or to your property, like a tree that is demonstrated to be cracked, those are still exempt from our code and retention requirements. Please still call us and tell us that you want to take out a tree though, because we want to track that. And so we have that information in our system in case anyone calls about that tree removal, we have a record of why that tree was removed. So we still want to track these through exemption requests, but we're not going to require permitting and reporting for these. But we do retain the right to request documentation after the fact if you don't contact us. But we're defining hazardous trees differently. So we are going to define hazard trees as something where a professional arborist, someone who has a tree risk assessment qualification, assesses that your tree is a high or extreme hazard. An extreme hazard, that's like the emergency hazard. That's like, it's going to fall down tomorrow. So that's really covered under the emergencies that I was just talking about. But that high hazard of this has structural defects, this has a disease, and this has a target that it may fall on, that is what we want to capture under the hazard tree assessment. And we want to make sure that these trees are going to be allowed to be removed if there is no mitigation or arboriculture practice that could alleviate that concern. And so this picture I have right here, a couple years ago, we had a big windstorm. It was the one where the winds came backwards, and so all the trees fell down because they weren't used to that wind. Those two, there's a little red arrow there. Those two trees came down, and it disrupted like the whole root plate back there. And so these two healthy, beautiful, wonderful trees, they have now become hazardous because their friends came down, and they have a structural defect, and they are posing a risk to the adjoining house. This is not currently something that is covered in our current code, and something that we want to make sure that if an arborist comes out and says, yes, this is a high hazard, those could come out in the near term, that those can be removed, even if they might be large, beautiful trees, because they are not trees we want to require to be retained in our environment. And then nuisance trees. Nuisance trees is very new. We didn't have any defined term for a nuisance tree, so we asked the community, what do you think a nuisance is? What do you think is a nuisance that we should exempt from retention requirements in our code update? And so we asked about damages to houses, to garages and sheds, to underground utilities or pipes, to private walkways or driveways, and public roads and sidewalks. And so we go from it depends to always, from the dark green to the light green. And what we heard is that if a tree is damaging or it's a very healthy and damaging your house or utilities, we had a lot of people who supported that those should be nuisances. So those are nuisances. And we had some support for garages, driveways, and sidewalks and roads. And those are things that we got comment on that is it possible to repair the sidewalk? Is it possible to repair the driveway? Could you move the shed? And so that is sort of what has been instilled into the nuisance tree definition. So, all right, so nuisance trees. So a tree that is not a hazard, because if it's a hazard, it's covered under hazard. But a tree that's not a hazard, but it's causing obvious physical damage to a habitable building, utilities, sidewalks, roads, driveways, parking lots. And the removal is allowed if it cannot be corrected through reasonable actions. Like, we're not going to make you move your house. We're not going to make you move your utility pipes, because that's kind of crazy. That tree is like growing in, like the pipe is inside the tree. That's kind of wild. But a shed, maybe it could be moved. A sidewalk, maybe it could be repaired. Those could be reasonable actions. So if there's nothing that can be done, and then it can be removed because it is a nuisance. So this is covering those very healthy trees that are causing a problem. All right. We're going through this so fast. Do we have any questions on hazard and nuisance? All right, we got one question over here. I'm going to give you the mic.
I don't know if this qualifies for the category right now, but there are tree retention, which is coming up next, which is part of building code. Hoping that we see something in your presentation about stricter requirements for tree retention. Had 4 logging trucks worth of trees taken out across the street. The developer was required to save specific trees as mandated by the city of Shoreline, and he cut them down anyway because the fines were not steep enough to keep him from doing it. So a huge piece of property was totally denuded, including the trees the city marked for saving. Hope that comes up.
Yes, we will be talking about tree retention next. Are there any questions regarding, and I hear your comment on the fines and enforcement and maintenance and stuff like that. Are there any questions on hazard or nuisance? I got one comment over here, and then I'll be back to you.
It sounds like, you're keeping the process for the emergency ones that are going to fall down tomorrow. What does the process look like if you do have an arborist come out and they say, well, this tree is hazardous, but it's not going to fall down tomorrow? Like, do they file the permit with the city? How long does that take? Like, what kind of documentation do you have to provide? Is it just the arborist good enough?
Yes, so if you want to remove a tree because you think it's a hazard or a nuisance, we would want to get an arborist report from an arborist. We would have a low cost or free permit to process that removal, and it would be a quick turnaround over-the-counter permit for that type of removal. Okay, I'm going to take Bonnie's question back here, and then we will move on to the next section. Oh, Alex.
Okay, so if I'm understanding this correctly, nuisance trees can be very healthy trees, and there's no other way of dealing with them, so they get removed. So are replacements required?
So we are evaluating options for requiring replacement trees for nuisance trees. If we required replacements, we would want to require them if it's the last tree you have on your property, or you really you have very, very few trees on your property. But what we're trying to do with our new sort of credit system is to not require replacement trees if you have a lot of trees already on your property. All right, I think that was 3 questions, so I'm going to keep going if that's okay. And we might have, if we're going through this so fast, we might have lots of time for questions later. All right, tree retention. This is a section of code that explicitly states what we care about being retained, whether or not development is happening or not. Can you remove a tree just because you want to? Can you remove a tree just because you want to build a shed or build a house or whatnot? So, our current code says you must keep 35% of your existing significant trees, and that applies in 9 zones of our city, which is 80% of it, because it's all our residential areas, it's all the areas where you're seeing townhome development, but it does not include 7 zones, which is where you're seeing the big apartment building development, and Aurora, and I have a zoning map coming up next. We'll talk a little bit about the spatial areas of the city. This number's also gone up over the years. It was set at 20%, then it was set at 25%, now it's set at 35%. So we keep raising this number, and it keeps not giving us the results that we want it to give us. Because what happens is there's no clear priority about what should be retained. It's 35% of any tree. I got 6 trees. I have 3 big trees and 3 small trees. Let me cut down all the big ones and keep the small ones, and let's keep going. So this is not getting us the result that we're looking for. And we're also, if zones are exempt, we're not getting tracking, so we're not seeing and counting the trees that are being removed. And here's my zoning map. So everywhere in the city, tree retention applies except for the teal. The teal, it doesn't apply. The purple and the blue, the Aurora corridor, it doesn't apply. And then the red areas, it does not apply. That is where we currently do not require tree retention. And through this whole process, we've talked to the community advisory group about where we should apply tree retention. And we've also we're going to be talking to Planning Commission about where we should be requiring tree retention. We asked the community where they thought we should care about tree retention the most. And from this whole survey, we heard that we should care about tree retention everywhere. So that keeping trees and keeping our canopy is very important everywhere in the city, regardless of what housing type is being proposed. But we do get a slight drop-off. We're talking about multifamily and apartment and light rail housing. But trees, in general, are important everywhere. We have heard that. And what we're trying to do in this code is set very clear expectations for where trees are going to be retained, sort of the balance of trees and housing and trees. Because it's very important, both of them. So, my clicker. So, instead of a percentage requirement, what we are saying in our draft code is we care that you keep the exceptional trees on your property. So if you had one exceptional tree, one large 24-inch tree, and you had 6 other trees that were very small, we wouldn't care about you keeping 35% of your trees. We would care about you keeping that one big tree, because we've decided that one has the most value and it has the most protections, and it is adding to our tree canopy and to our environment. And we want to make sure that those get protected from just sort of anyone taking out a tree if they don't have a reason. So what we want to see when someone comes in because they want to take out a tree to build a deck or to build a shed or to build a house, that all those improvements, they get clustered on a piece of property to avoid having to remove large trees and large groves of trees. And that we set sort of a limit on how much of a tree or how much of a property we would like get completely cleared. So I have a property that is completely covered in trees. It's a whole grove. I got a little house and I want to build a bigger house. Our code would say, because your hardscape allowance in that property, because that is the main way we as a city regulate how much development can happen, is how much of your property can you cover in a hard surface substance. If our hardscape allowance in our neighborhood residential 3 zone, that's our lowest density zone, is 50%, then one could clear cut 50% of that lot. That's okay. But the other 50% with that big grove on it, let's keep those trees. So, and this is trying to set a limit on where we're always going to allow for tree removal, where we're always going to allow for building, but we want to make sure we're keeping exceptional trees outside of that. So somewhere in the city, we might save a lot of exceptional trees. It's going to be a lot of them. Maybe we can save all of them. But we're setting sort of expectations on what some means. Because sometimes it might not be a lot. Sometimes I have a really high hardscape allowance. I can go up to 75, 80%, 90% of my lot. And that means that there might not be enough space to retain a tree, or maybe I'm just retaining one large tree. And then it's okay to just save that one tree, because the purpose of that zone is to allow for more development and more space and more hard surface. And so we're saving some trees in all scenarios, but the amount of trees is going to be different depending on retained, is going to be different depending on the purpose of that zone. And as for where this applies, this is a key question we're taking to Planning Commission. Because right now we don't have tree retention in our areas that are closest to light rail and along Aurora, where we want to see higher density development occur. And so it will be a question for Planning Commission, is this something that we want to do everywhere and have everyone evaluate, knowing that on smaller lots in high density zones, we may not see a lot of tree retention because there's just not a lot of room on a small lot with a high developable area to retain a tree. But on bigger lots, it might be possible. So this is a question that is still going to happen through Planning Commission. So that is my tree retention section. Do we have questions? I'm going to do here and then here. Oh, Alex, you're sneaky back there.
Thank you. Could you go back to that slide before?
Yeah, can you speak into the mic?
Yes. Okay, the slide on the right, or the illustration on the right.
Mm-hmm.
So you would save the 6 DBH tree, or the
the 6 credit tree.
The 6 credit tree, and all of the other trees could be removed
Yes.
without replacements.
Not without replacements. Replacements are going to be determined on the credit requirement of that zone, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Okay, and the second bullet there, removal of exceptional trees is allowed if retention would limit the buildable area. There's no protection for exceptional trees.
That is what the illustration is showing, that is what the protection is that those trees that are all not covered in orange, none of those trees are impacting that site to have 50% buildable area. And so all those trees are protected. But on the other side, those trees are limiting the buildable area, and so they can be removed. But we want to start every process with retaining as many trees as makes sense for the purpose and development anticipated in that zone.
Just one follow-up. It's up to the builder to decide that. Is that correct?
It is, we want to hear from the building designer and from an arborist to understand the constraints on that site, and it is an administrative process between the applicant and the review staff on making sure that all options have been exhausted as far as building and protecting trees before removal is allowed.
Thank you.
So my question is about the hardscape allowances. Is that something that's established in the building code?
So our hardscape allowance is set in our zoning code. It is one in, it's 20, I think, is our zoning code. And we have a dimensional standards table which sets the hardscape allowance. It sets the height restrictions and the setbacks for all property in the city depending on the zone that it's in. I got a third question back here. Alex, you got this?
Oh, thank you. What about the situation where a developer decides to subdivide a piece of property? Because we just found out the townhomes next to us actually have 2 different addresses. It wasn't originally sold as one lot. So does that change the tree retention if you have a subdivision?
So
in that zone, MUR 35 or MUR 45?
Yes. So we still want you to make sure that you are retaining trees the max that you can retain them, subdivision or not. That if you're going to subdivide your property, that you're doing it in such a way that both properties are as compact as they can in order to retain the trees that you have on the site if they are not impacting the ability to build out your buildable area. So we would take into account before the subdivision happens to make sure that we continue to protect trees. All right. Is this making sense so far? Okay, excellent. Good. That's our goal. We want to make this understandable, but it's not confusing. All right. So, clicker. Here we go. All right, regulated tree removal. So we talked about first what you can always remove regardless of retention. Then we talked about what we're always going to care about you retaining regardless of what you're doing. And now we're going to talk about what you can always remove without replacement requirements. So these are different buckets of applicability here. So again, this is regulated tree removal. We got a board over there. This is our process for if you just want to take out a tree on your property and not be required to get an arborist report or have to replace trees on your property. Like, I just want to go take out a tree. Can I do it or not? Like, make this easy for me because I can take out a tree. And this is specifically for people who are not planning on doing big projects and just wanting to remove a tree just because. Because if you want to remove a big tree, wanted to build something, then we want to make sure that we're protecting against, again, those protected exceptional trees and that we're going to meet our minimum credits, which we will talk about next. So we have this in our current code. Our current code has a partial exemption, which is fun. What is a partial exemption? How is something partially exempt? But we say that a partially exemption is on any property, you can remove 3 trees over 3 years, no questions asked. And that is up to a lot that is 1,400 square feet. And then once you get above 1,400 square feet, for every additional 7,000 square feet of property you have, you can retain 3 more trees. So it just kind of grows. The more property you have, the more trees you can take out kind of exponentially into the future. But this only applies when trees are 24 inches or less. So this currently only applies to small trees. We currently don't let you take out large trees through a process like this. Our issue is that this is exempt from permitting. It's very hard to track. It's also very hard to track over the 3-year period. It also stacks with detention requirements. So you can take out your exempt requirements and then retain on the trees that you don't have to retain the trees that were exempt. It's confusing and it stacks. We're trying to get away from that. And it's possible to remove all trees. If you had all small trees on your property, you could just keep taking out trees until you've cleared your entire lot. And so we've heard that keeping tree canopy is very important. So we're trying to instill that into the draft code. So we asked, why do you think tree removal should be allowed? First, we asked, do you think a property owner has to have a reason to remove a tree? 49% of people said yes. 49% of people said yes, there should be a reason to take out a tree. And we had 37% that said no, property owners should never provide a reason. And so these are going to be the rules for not having to provide any reason to take out a tree. If it's a hazard or nuisance, we already talked about that. If you're building something, we're going to talk about that later. But if you're just building like a little shed or a little deck or a little something, or you just want to have more light or sun, or you just want to take out a tree because this is the rule for you. Clicker. Oh no. It worked. Okay, we also asked if you should be able to take out a very large tree just because. Hazard nuisance, again, very strong responses. Being able to take out a hazard nuisance tree. We've already covered that. Because you want to build something, less support for that. But again, we've already covered that with our tree retention requirements. And whether or not plant or not, we're going to come back to the tree credits later. But just because to have more light sun, these had less support. And so we are continuing with our previous code that anything that is not exceptional, you're not going to be able to remove under this process without replacements. There we go. And then tree canopy, having tree canopy, maintaining tree canopy, increasing tree canopy has come up many, many times throughout this process. And so we asked, do you think, we currently require replacement trees for everything, but do you think every property should be required to have a minimum number of trees? We're kind of 50-50 split on this. We got 50% of people said strongly agree or agree, and we had about a third of people who disagreed or strongly disagreed. Our code will say that a minimum number of trees is required if you cut down or trigger our tree code. So, our regulated tree removal. These are the new rules. This is us retooling that previous partial exemption. So we're still allowing for some limited tree removal without any permit, with a permit, but without any replacements, without any documentation. So depending on your lot size, you can remove up to 3 trees per year without any replacements, as long as you still have trees. So if you have a lot of trees, you can take out some trees, as long as you still have some trees on your property. But through this process, we're not going to allow for clear cutting of property, that if someone wants to take out all of the trees, then we're going to want to see replacements happen, and we're going to evaluate whether or not this tree removal is allowed through another process. So if you have trees, you can come out and take a tree, but we still want to make sure you have trees, and that trees are get planted, and you want to take them all out. So the impacts of this. So I got a property, and I have a lot of trees on this property. If I have, and then the numbers indicate the number of credits that tree is worth. That's not clear. That's what those numbers say. So you cannot remove an exceptional tree under this provision. And that means that you cannot remove an exceptional tree without an arborist assessment of the impacts of that tree removal or replacement trees, if you do not meet the tree credit minimum. So if you want to remove a tree just because, for no reason, without documentation, I can remove one small tree. That's good. Awesome. I can remove over time, or if I have a big lot, that small grove of trees. That's fine. It's not exceptional. It's okay. We will allow for that type of removal. They're not the ones that we're prioritizing for retention in the code. But one big tree, that's not something, if it's healthy, it's not hazard, it's just I want to take that out just because. We have protections. We have retention requirements. Those trees can't be removed through this process without documentation from an arborist, any reason for removal. And same with the big grove. You got a big grove back there. Those need to stay until you have a reason to remove it, and we walk through whether or not that can be removed based on the retention requirements we talked about before. So we're going to keep those exceptional trees, those protected trees, unless there is a reason to remove them that an applicant comes to us with, that I need to remove that tree because I'm going to build a deck, I'm going to build a shed, I'm going to build an accessory dwelling unit, I need to put my aunt in my backyard in a shed, and so, well, not in a shed, I'm going to build her an actual house. Then we're going to talk about, hey, do I need to take out that big tree to move it, or am I going to put my shed somewhere else? ADU. So, but just because we're going to make sure those trees are kept so that we're maintaining our tree canopy and the trees that matter the most for our environment. So that is regulated tree removal. 3 questions. I got one back here, Alex. Okay, and then I got in the hat, and then here.
Did I get in? So I have a question about 2 slides back where it looked like that's that one there. Doesn't this, where it says permit required, doesn't that contradict that you said, I thought that this whole purpose was that there were no permits required for this process?
I require a permit so that I can track that you took out that tree, but I don't need you to go talk to an arborist. I don't need you to, it's going to be like a very low cost or no fee permit. This is, you're required to notify us that you are doing this, but we don't need additional documentation.
And how long does that permit process take?
That would be, we try to process those in about a week.
Okay, cool.
All right, and then Alex, you want to raise your hand?
Hi, so the regulated bunch. So someone up the street, which we all know and we see, they take out a perfectly huge, wonderful madrone that's over 80 years old. So what happens?
If someone takes out a tree without a permit?
Yeah.
If someone takes out a tree without a permit, then we would get code enforcement involved if we get notified about it, because we are a complaint-based system. And then we would go out there and evaluate sort of what the infraction was, and then evaluate what fines look like.
What? So
if someone takes out a tree,
let's assume that they didn't get a permit, that it was a healthy tree. They get a fine. What kind of fine?
Okay, so our current fine for removing a tree that is 24 inches or greater is $15,000. That is a very large fine.
Do we? I mean, really, it's a real question. Do we enforce that? 'Cause, I mean, there's a lot of people that can't pay that.
We do enforce that fine. Yes.
Okay.
So, and we're looking at evaluating that fine cost, and also looking at scaling that so we don't jump from nothing up to 15, that we sort of evaluate what those fines should be set at. And also, if trees are removed without a permit, we will have restoration requirements, and so those will require replacement trees and monitoring to make sure that those trees get planted and succeed. Okay, then I had a third question back here. Can you wait for the mic? Alex is bringing the mic.
Can you tell me what the definition of a large grove and a small grove is? How close do they have to be together to be called a grove?
So a grove is any 3 trees with overlapping canopy. I become a large grove when the diameter of the trees within my grove all have a value that meets the threshold for us to call it a large grove. So if I had 12 very small trees, that might be considered an exceptional grove. If I had 4 medium-sized trees that were all like 18 inches wide, that might be considered an exceptional grove. If I had a very, very big grove, that's considered exceptional. And we've picked this number 12 here for a couple of different reasons, which I will get into in our next sort of minimum credit section. So if I have a small grove, I had like 3 smaller trees, then here, if I move forward. So I got 3 small trees. One's worth 2 credits, one's worth 3, one's worth 4. And you can determine how much your tree is worth by measuring the diameter of it. That wouldn't be considered large. We wouldn't protect it the way that we would protect a larger grove. Does that answer your question? It is a shift in the way we do things. I do agree. So we're going to keep talking about credits, though. Yes. Okay, yes. The question was, do the numbers in the circles match the credit of the tree? And yes, they do. Yes. So every tree is worth a credit value. The credit value is based on its diameter. And the bigger the diameter, the bigger the value of that tree. The smaller the diameter, the less credit value that tree is worth. And then depending on how big your property is, you may be required to have more credits of trees or less credits of trees, which is what we'll get into. And then this is calculating the amount of credits on this property. Is it based on the type of tree? That is the question. It is not based on the type of tree because our staff are not trained arborists. We do not have an arborist on staff, and so we are evaluating trees based on their size. Right. So I got my clicker back. I'm going to keep moving back through tree credits. And I think we're making a really good time here, which is fantastic. All right. So we talked about what you can always remove. We talked about what we always want to make you keep. We talked about what you can remove without replacement requirements if you're not doing anything at all. And now we're going to talk about what we would require if you did want to remove a lot of trees. If you did want to remove an exceptional tree, if you did want to build something, what kind of requirements would you be held to? So, replacement requirements. We currently require you to plant 1 to 3 replacement trees for every tree removed. And so up to a 12-inch tree and a 12-inch tree, which is not a very big tree, 3 replacement trees for that tree. These are very high replacement requirements. We find that they're comparable to other cities. It's a lot of replacement trees being required. And we run into like weird configurations with that. If I got a big lot and I take out 1 tree, I replace 3 trees. I have a very forested lot, I take out 1 tree, I have to replace 3 trees. I don't have anywhere to plant those trees. We have problems with this. We have people who say, I planted a tree and it immediately died because they got no sun. And we also have weirdness where we have properties with no trees that don't ever need to have trees. And we do give exemptions to people to reduce their planting requirement because it does become very, very high very quickly. So a couple of things we asked that are relevant to this section in the survey is we asked people, do you think trees and tree planting and tree code requirements should be the same everywhere in the city, or should they scale based on the amount of development proposed? The zone and the density and development. We got 62% said, yes, we should scale. And so this is something that is instilled in the code update. We've already talked about the scaling. We talked about the tree retention for exceptional trees and how that scales with the hardscape. And we're also scaling our planting requirements by zone as well. And then again, minimum tree credits, minimum tree number, 50% said yes, 30% said strongly disagree, property owners should be allowed to choose their own landscaping. And so to meet our tree canopy requirements, we are moving to requiring more tree planting on properties that do not currently have a lot of trees. So, tree credits. Instead of requiring you to retain a minimum number of your existing trees and then replacing the trees that you removed, we are going to start requiring that you keep a minimum credit of trees. Not including exceptional trees, well, including exceptional trees, but exceptional trees are kind of on the top there because we protect them. But the number of tree credits will be required per lot. And the number of tree credits that you're required is going to be dependent on the size of your property. So a smaller property is going to have, because it's smaller, it's going to have a smaller requirement. And a larger property, because it's larger, is going to have a larger requirement. So we're scaling the amount of trees required based on the size of the property. And we're also going to scale it depending on the zone you're in. And so a lower density zone where we have lower hardscape allowances, we have lower density of development, we will have a higher tree credit minimum, because that is the area of the city where there is planting space available to either retain or plant trees. And in the areas of our city where we have higher density development, we still want to have a tree minimum because we want to see trees planted. We know that having green in our urban environment is important for the reasons we've talked about. But maybe it's not as much as can happen in a less dense area of the city. So we would walk through this process if you were going to remove a lot of trees, if you were to come in and build a new property or a new development in the back of your lot or take down an exceptional tree. We're not going to come out and say, right now you didn't do anything, you have to plant trees. That's not the way this is going to work. This works if you come to us and you start triggering this for whatever reason. And the threshold in which this does get triggered, we're going to talk to Planning Commission about. Because this is going to be different than what we currently do. Currently, if you don't cut down a tree, we don't apply tree code. Now, we might, whoop, I dropped my clicker. You might have to, if you didn't cut down any trees, you don't have any trees, we might still make you plant in order to meet that minimum credit amount. Okay. All right. So, visualizing these minimum credits. We have a multiplier. We have set this, again, what the credit is. And I want to be very clear. This can be met in many, many different ways. This can be met through retaining trees. This can be met through planting trees. This could be met through fee in lieu. This could be met by planting a couple trees that could become big. This can be met by planting a bunch of trees that are small and short. And we're going to have a planting list that sort of gives ideas of what trees meet different types of credits. Because we give credits to trees that exist, and we give credits to trees that are planted. And so planted trees are also worth a scale of credits depending on how big they might get in the future by their canopy size, not by their height, their canopy size. So a wide, short tree is worth a lot because it's providing canopy, and a really, really tall, skinny tree may be worth less because it's not providing a lot of canopy. So if our credit system in the draft code is currently set that on the average shoreline lot is 8,000 square feet. So what we see most commonly, you need 12 tree credits. And that's why we set the large grove number at 12, because if you have one large grove, that means you met your minimum tree credit. That means we will not require you to replant trees on your property. If you already have a large grove of trees, keep it, but we're not going to require any replanting. But maybe you only have one big tree. Maybe you have a combination of trees that all equal the minimum. That's okay. You have trees that don't equal the minimum, then let's plant. And if you don't have any trees at all, we might require you to plant. And I will reiterate that the threshold for when this kicks in, if no trees are removed, is something questioned that we'll take into Planning Commission. Clicker. There we go. Okay, so more visuals for you. 11,000 square foot lot can meet their minimum credit through an assortment. They got one exceptional tree. They got several smaller trees. They got a couple of medium trees. They met their minimum, no planting required. Or maybe they just planted those 3 little trees to make up the difference. And so this is the kind of tree canopy that we want to see in our city. So, impacts. I'm going to move through impacts now because this is relevant to what I just talked about. So, we understand that if we are going to require the retention of lots of big, exceptional trees and groves of trees that may have impacts on use of property, and that it may require, we may not see a lot of detached development taking out trees if those trees are there. And that we may require more compact housing, and that may also lead to some less housing being developed if someone does not want to build attached. We know that on a large property, it might be easier to save a lot of trees, and a smaller property may not save a lot of trees because they just need to be able to build on a percentage of their lot, and so it's going to be okay to take out trees. And this is the same on bigger properties and with bigger amounts of development that happen. So on a small property, it may be very hard if I'm going to build a small apartment building to keep a tree because I do have a high amount of developable area that I'm allowed. But if I got a big property and I'm building an apartment building, maybe there's room. Maybe we have a conversation. And so again, this is what we're taking to Planning Commission. We're going to ask them, should we require this with apartment buildings? Again, our lower density zones, our areas of the city where we have less development potential, those are going to need to keep more trees because they have less developable area. And areas of the city that have higher development potential, they might keep less trees because the purpose of those zones leads to higher density development, and we evaluate retention based on those retention requirements that we spoke about. And sometimes it's just really unclear. Sometimes trees don't lead to like a very reasonable space. We're like, oh, that's obviously a place where I can put something. And this is when we really want to work with the professionals in the industry, our professional arborists, our builder community, and our design community to understand what is a way that makes development and tree retention feasible on a site like this. Maybe some of those big exceptional trees come out because they're blocking access to the back of that site. And maybe some of them do get retained. But we want to approach every project with the idea that some trees can be retained and that we have a reasonable level expectations for allowing for development. And again, even if a property does not take out trees and completely redevelops, they may be required to plant, again, to meet that minimum credit requirement. And I do want to say that trees are living in our environment. We know they can grow, they can change, they can disrupt our lives, they can be amazing. And we do know that tree retention is possible when talking about our high-density development areas. I got this guy in Bothell, that's 6 oaks outside of the 6 Oaks apartment building in Bothell. They kept 6 oaks. And look at them, they're doing all great and awesome there. They got the little planting strip. We can save trees. But sometimes it doesn't work. The bottom picture, that is Elm Hall without its flagship elm because the elm died. They spent a lot of time and energy designing around that tree that did not survive. And so just understanding that we can have a code that puts a lot of emphasis around retaining large exceptional trees, but that does not mean that those trees will always be there. And I just wanted to share a little bit. These are pictures of this right here. This is in the 148 station area. They retained a large grove of trees. It is the open space on their property, and it is sort of like an underbrush, understory forest area. It's not really space you want to go hang out in. That one up there, that is a middle housing development in Ravenna. They had a lovely sort of single family, 2 apartments, but they saved a bunch of like really excellent fir trees. And it's amazing, they kept them, but it's not really open space under those trees. It is forest area has been set aside to protect those trees. And in our apartment buildings, we get open space. And so if we go down and want to make sure that we're keeping trees in our high density areas, that may mean that we're retaining more trees as more sort of open space set aside for trees, and we get less open space set aside for people. So our pop apartment buildings in Bothell, that's a 2nd story above a parking garage. Look at all those trees. We got these 2 down here. These are both in Shoreline. They're not quite as filled in as the one in Bothell here, but you see we do have sort of green space set aside for people who live in those buildings. And it is something that we can continue to work with our builder community on, making sure that our open space requirements are meeting the needs of our community. So I'm just going to quickly run through these last pieces, and then we'll do another round of questions. Exceptional trees. We want to see those retained. You can remove some small trees if they're not exceptional through regulated tree removal. No questions asked. That's cool. Remove them. You can take out some large trees because they're exceptional, because they're a hazard and nuisance, because we want to make sure those trees always are removed. If you're going to remove a lot of small trees or propose site development that triggers compliance with tree credit, we will need you to meet the tree credit minimum, which will require you to show compliance through retention, planting, or fee in lieu. And we're only going to remove exceptional trees if proven necessary to allow development or building or improvement on that site. We've already talked about sort of what that looks like from a retention point of view, and that we are evaluating allowing for, if exceptional trees are retained, the open space underneath those trees would count as open space requirements. And so we started with the goals. And we talked about all the changes we've made. And so how are we actually expecting this to meet the goals that we set out to do? So our goal to support city goals to increase tree canopy. We're going to focus on prioritizing keeping the trees that matter the most for our tree canopy, those large, mature trees and those large groves and stands of trees. And that we require tree planting on properties that have few trees in order to continue to grow and increase our tree canopy. That we support our goals to meet our housing and transportation and livability goals, that we're going to require development to cluster. That we're not just going to cut down trees because we can. If we can build more efficiently with our space, we should do so to retain some of those trees. And then we're going to scale again our retention and our planting requirements based on the zone that you are in. And so lower density zones might have more trees, and higher density zones may have less trees. They will still have trees. Balance our housing goals and our tree goals. This is why we want to set very clear expectations and sort of limits for where development is going to always be able to cut down trees, and then where trees will always be able to be retained regardless of development. Have a user-friendly code. We want to have a very objective standards for when tree removal is allowed, so that when you come to us with a problem, we have a pathway to show you, here is the pathway we're going to take to be able to remove a tree, that we always want to give an out for you. So even if you come to us with an exceptional tree, we'd evaluate. I want to take it out just because we would walk through a process of evaluating, okay, what is the reason, and sort of walk through removal. Reasonable exemptions. Trees that are large and are causing damage, they can be removed. And that is going to be okay, because we want to allow for those types of trees to be removed within our urban environment. And that is the end of my presentation, which we did in an hour, which is honestly a little impressive, I think. And I would love, at this point, to answer more questions. Okay. And I want to be very clear. I'm here to answer questions about what's being presented tonight. If you have comments, concerns, and input that you want to give about these regulations, please write to us. Give public comment at Planning Commission. That is the way that we are going to be able to record and make sure that those comments and concerns are embedded within the tree code. Alex, why don't we go over here first?
This is in regard to reasonable exemptions. I want to make sure that the code has enough carve-outs so that people can make good decisions. Here's a hypothetical. Someone has a 7,000 square foot lot, and 40 years ago somebody planted a hedge of leyland cypress, and they've become 10 inches in diameter each. There's 10 of them in a row. There's no backyard left, essentially. And it makes sense for these trees to be removed and replaced with a proper hedge. But under the new code, as I read it, this person can only take out one tree per year. And he's not going to spend 10 years taking out trees. We don't want to get into the situation where it's a catch me if you can. So in other words, reasonable exemptions needs to include things beyond trees that are causing damage to infrastructure. We need to come up with a way of defining trees that have outgrown their space and get the right tree in the right place. And because people out there are not going to wait 10 years to replace a hedge. And how do you correct for it? You bond it. You ask them to post a bond to say, okay, you have 12 months to replace these trees. That's important in the new code.
Yes. So I want to clarify. The one tree a year, that is if you want to remove it without documentation and without replacement requirements. You can take out more trees than that. We just want to make sure that we're going to walk through our permitting process and that we are documenting the trees being removed and making sure they're getting replaced in order to meet the minimum tree credit or replace it in kind. Janet.
So critical areas. So I know you said we're not talking about critical areas. However, many private property owners have critical areas on their property. And they have trees that might be right on the edge, or they might be in the buffer of the critical area. Mm-hmm. So whether it's a steep slope a wetland, a creek, critical areas do come into play here, and there has to be consideration. Likewise, street trees. Some people might have no sidewalk, and they have trees that have been on their property for a long time, but they're actually street trees because they're in the right-of-way. Or they grew big enough, so now they're in the right-of-way, or they're right on the border. So I'd like you to. I know it's too much to get into right now, but it's something to consider because it's very important, especially critical areas.
So we're not talking about critical areas tonight because all vegetation in a critical area has different rules for removal. And so if it's in a critical area or in a buffer and it is a large tree, it's already being protected through the critical areas code. And so it only can be removed for like the reasonable use of property and through any exemptions in the critical areas code. Things that are on the edge, that's something where that might be something that we prioritize. That we want you to keep that tree and make sure that you're keeping that tree and that is, if it's not encroaching in the area that you can build on. And then street trees, people, I understand, do not necessarily know exactly where the property and right-of-way line is, and that's why we really encourage anyone to call us if they want to take out a tree, because then we can look at our map and we actually have an inventory now of all street trees. And so it's not exhaustive, because it's very hard sometimes to tell exactly what a street tree is, but we can help you figure out where that tree falls in the rules for removal. Alex, can we go here?
This is kind of having to do with the critical areas and the minimum credit requirement calculation. So let's say I wanted to, for funsies, do that calculation for my property. Mm-hmm. How do I, and so how I understand it is that I would go around and I would measure all the trees and give it a number that I assume I'd find in the code, mm-hmm, based on whatever the code says. Do critical so will I be including trees that are in critical areas in the overall calculation of my credit requirement?
Right now, the way the code is written, critical areas are not included in the calculation. So if you looked at your property and part of it was encumbered, we would not count that area as part of your lot when deciding what your minimum tree credit is. Likewise, the trees in critical areas would not count.
You don't get credit for stewarding and caring for the trees in the critical area.
So the question is whether or not trees within the critical area would count towards your tree credit minimum. In the draft code, as it stands, they do not. It is something that can be evaluated as we discuss with Planning Commission.
Yeah, I also just want to point out if you're counting less of your property towards that credit, your credit requirement is lower because you're not, you've got that other section. So it's like, let's say 6,000 of your 8,000 square foot lot is covered in critical areas. Your credit's only like 1 or 2 credits.
So I would have to, in order to do my calculation, I would have to go out and I would have to, one, know the area of my property that is considered critical area, and then calculate the tree requirement without.
So we have.
So the question here is sort of how to calculate out the minimum area when critical areas are involved. I would love to take this question offline and not try to answer it in this forum, if that's okay with you. Because we understand that this process, we might need evaluation, especially when critical areas are involved and development is involved, delineations from a wetland biologist, or we could use our mapping where we do have buffers from streams and stuff to calculate that area. So there's a couple different options, but I think these are great questions because it helps us understand where we still need to figure out the code. Mallory, how are we doing on time? All right, about 10 more minutes.
So I understand that the minimum, like the credit requirements get triggered when you do development, when you want to build an ADU, tear down your house and build a new one. Under the current draft code, is there any other way to trigger it? Like if, say, I don't know, I have a house that only has one tree, would you at any point like come make me plant trees, or only if I apply to you because I want to build an ADU or a shed or whatever?
We would never come to you and say you have to plant. It would be triggered if you came to us with an application where you wanted to build something that triggered it, or you wanted to remove that tree.
Okay.
Let's come over here.
Tonight, there's been no discussion of the current code or proposed changes to topping of large trees or exceptional trees. Is that something that you guys are considering in the process?
Our code maintenance requirements are going to continue to follow the ANSI 300 tree care standards, where topping of trees is not an allowed maintenance of trees. And so that was continued to not be allowed. We do, however, allow for other pruning that is within those tree care standards. I think like windowing, like limbing up of trees and other things to prune that tree without having to top it, because topping does have known negative impacts on the health of trees and can create hazards.
And is there currently or proposed a financial penalty if someone's topping a tree and is in violation?
Yes, violations of the code would be subject to enforcement, and topping of a tree would be a violation. It is currently like that in our existing code. This is not a change. This is we are continuing this.
Kind of on that topic, are you? I know you're currently, or we will be encouraging the saving of wildlife trees. So a tree that's deemed to be a hazardous tree that is going to be removed. Does it have to be fully removed, or can people get credit for saving that as a wildlife tree? And that's where you keep that section of a tree. Maybe it's been crowned at the top, so that if we're removing all of the dead trees, we're not going to have any more wildlife trees for the animals, to woodpeckers and things like that.
So I'm going to go to critical areas for a second, because in critical areas we require trees to be left as snags, or in some way encourage to be left as snags. Outside of critical areas, we don't regulate dead vegetation. And so it's a weird pathway to give credit for something that we don't regulate. What we can do, though, is encourage, when trees are removed, to be left as wildlife snags.
I just have a quick question with regards to the zones and what's within scope of the code and what is outside. So, because I maybe you showed the neighborhoods with the yellow. Do they is it still that they do not have any retention requirements, or does this apply to these questions of retention and exceptional trees and trying to retain some trees? Is that citywide or only outside of those yellow zones?
So we are evaluating retention citywide in all zones, even the ones where it's currently exempt. And we're going to talk about the pros and the cons of that type of retention and the impact that has with Planning Commission. We've talked about it with the Community Advisory Group, and we're going to continue that discussion with Planning Commission and then with City Council. Alex. Another one.
There was a question regarding topping trees, and how does that work in a place where there's view protection in Innisarden, where that people buy that as part of what they're buying into the community?
Mm-hmm. So we don't want to encourage topping of trees as a way to solve the view covenant issue. We want to encourage better maintenance practices, and we want to also evaluate our reasonings to be able to remove trees, because topping trees can create hazards again, and so removing trees and planting trees that work better in view areas is something that's contemplated within the code.
does the code or the draft code talk about plants that are on the King County noxious weed list as noxious weeds or weeds of concern?
Yes. So plants that are on either the Washington or King County list of noxious and invasive species are plants that we will never require you to retain. They are exempt from the code. They are also trees that we will prohibit you from planting as replacement trees.
I have a question about the right-of-way. Can new developments use the right-of-way to plant new trees and get credit? Because one of your examples there in the Ballfill high density, you're showing examples of great, beautiful trees in the right-of-way.
Yes. So we do currently have right-of-way tree planting requirements, and that's all taken care of through our, we have this like really bright line when it comes to regulating trees in shoreline. And I understand there are pros and cons of allowing for things to work for another, but we do throughout this process, we're not currently saying that street tree planting can count as your tree credits on a multifamily building, but your tree credits for a multifamily building would be much lower and obtainable to have in a multifamily environment. But you wouldn't be double counting. You can, however, double count landscaping trees. Landscaping trees, if planted to meet tree credit standards, can account for both. Because we have landscaping standards in all of our station area and commercial zones. Okay, I got a question, and then I know we have a question over here too.
Okay, back to my question or topic that I hinted at 45 minutes ago. Tree retention, if a development is required to retain specific trees and they cut them down, what is the fine? What is the penalty? I heard you mention at some point something like $15,000 for cutting down a tree that was supposed to be retained and that was removed. How many trees do they have to replace one for trees they cut down? Significant trees are important. This particular development cut down all the significant trees for logging trucks worth, and part of their replacement was 2 little teeny tiny street trees that are like a 3-inch caliber. So I'm hoping that has changed or is being addressed in this new tree code. Stiffer penalties and higher requirements for replacements when they remove trees that should not have been taken out.
So the way the current code, the draft code, is evaluating penalties is, again, we currently have a fine of $15,000 for a 24-inch tree. And so then we kind of scale down or up from there, and we're evaluating sort of that number. If a tree is taken out without a permit and it's not exempt under the new code, then we would have replacement, we would have fines that would be evaluated with our city attorney, and then we would also have replacement requirements to replace in kind the credits removed. So if someone took out a very large tree that was worth 6 credits, they need to replace 6 credits worth of tree. If they take out one very small tree with 1 credit worth of tree. But importantly, we do have an option where if it's proven that the trees cannot be planted on site, that fees and other in lieu options can be done. And we do have restoration requirements, yes.
So the question is, replacement tree options. In the new code, will there be like a list that we have to use for replacement trees?
So we're going to have a lovely little list of trees. It's going to have trees that are worth a lot of credits, and then trees that are worth the medium amount of credits, and then trees that are worth a small amount of credits. These are our preferred planting trees. These are trees that we already said, we know what these are worth. If you want to plant a different tree, as long as it's not on the noxious weed list, you can plant that. You just need to tell us how it meets our requirements here. Alex, behind you.
Sierra, when does a newly planted street tree transfer to becoming a city of shoreline responsibility? I'm thinking about a planting of elm trees on 185th and 5th Avenue Northeast. The trees are too big. I don't think they're getting any water. I don't trust Sound Transit to keep them alive. And at some point, what is that point at which shoreline takes over?
I'm hearing the question. I am not a person who can answer that question for you. Mallory, do you know who would be the best person to answer a question about street trees and Sound Transit? Okay.
I mean,
but I can give you a business card and we can follow up and try to get you to the right place. But I'm hearing from my panel over here that we are at time because it is 8:30 and some of you have been here for like 2.5 hours. I really want to thank everyone for listening here tonight. I have business cards if you would like my email, and then I can get you connected to places where you can give your input. We have feedback being collected in the back on sticky notes. Online, there is a comment form. If you go to our Engage page, we will post all of this, you can read it, and then you can also give us comment there. Please come to Planning Commission this summer. We're going on July 16th. We're also going to be there in August, in September, in October. Continue to be part of this process. You can come to Planning Commission. You can provide written comment. There are lots of opportunities for you to continue to voice your concerns or support in this process. So with that, Mallory, do you have any, do we need to close out any particular way? We're all good? All right. Well, thank you. Amazing.